Hello, my name is Zach Schwan, and I'm a member of the Advancement Office. I'm joined here today by Jeff Segrave, Professor of Health and Exercise Science, and David H. Porter, Endowed Chair. Jeff's main area of scholarly interest lies in the socio-cultural analysis of sport. Hence, he embraces an interdisciplinary approach that seeks to study sport at the intersections of history, sociology, and literature. His current areas of scholarly interest are the Olympic Games, sport and cartoons, and tennis and American literature. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you. That's an interesting combination, isn't it?
It
Olympic
is.
Games, tennis and literature, and sport and cartoons.
Covering quite a base there. So starting off, were the Rio Games a success, and what were the highlights of the Games this year?
Well, they were certainly a success in the sense that despite all the doom and gloom and all the naysayers, the Rio Organizing Committee pulled it off, and they pulled it off well. The one dimension of the Olympic Games that troubled me from the beginning, of course, was the possibility of a terrorist attack, which never happened. But they were a success on all sorts of levels. They were certainly a success from the performance level. I think we had some of the greatest performance in Olympic history. And I think in some ways these games will go down in the annals of Olympic history because of some of the spectacular athletic performances. One only has to think of Usain Bolt, whose personality and character were absolute delight, but whose performance was truly spectacular. To win 3 gold medals in the sprint events, 3 consecutive Olympic Games in a row, is really unparalleled and unmatched, a phenomenal performance. And we had Katie Ledecky, who sort of swam out of the pool and left everyone so far behind. It was unbelievable. You had Simone Biles, I think many people feel is potentially, if not already, the greatest gymnast, female gymnast in Olympic history, if not world history. She's truly a phenomenon. So from the perspective of the athletic performance, is great success. It was certainly a great success for NBC. And all NBC's affiliates. They're online streaming, they're on television broadcasting. The activity that all their affiliates undertook with regard to the Olympics was truly spectacular. And the president of the NBC Olympic Sports was waxing lyrical about how these were the most successful Olympic Games in history. And from his perspective, if you look at the numbers, hundreds of millions of spectators, in terms of the television, they were a fabulous success. And the streaming was one of the biggest successes of all. Never have so many minutes been allocated to streaming Olympic Games as was so in this case. So NBC is happy. Their affiliates are happy. And one would imagine, given the success of the Games themselves, their sponsors are happy. And it was a spectacular venue. Nothing plays on television better than Copacabana Beach or Guanabara Bay, or the beautiful hills and mountains that surround Rio. It's really a spectacular scene. It's an iconic geographical spot, and it plays so well on the television. So from that perspective, it was also an enormous success. And there's one thing one should not forget. Following these Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games, they actually had, for the first time in history, they actually had Dog Olympics, which was a great success. It was a light-hearted way of having all sorts of the population of Rio and visitors who had dogs come in and do these Dog Olympics. I'm a dog lover, so you have to love any Olympic Games that can actually have a Dog Olympics associated with it.
That's terrific. You mentioned Usain Bolt. Is it possible for him to do it a 4th time?
It's hard to use the word impossible when you're talking about Usain Bolt. It seems unlikely. I don't know if he has the energy and the stamina to undergo 4 years of intensive training to prepare himself for the Tokyo Games. Mm-hmm. What we see when we see these athletes perform, of course, is the tip of the iceberg.
Right. They're peaking at the time of the Games.
Right.
Yeah.
But you don't see the incredibly grueling regimen that they have to sustain in order to get to that point. And it's not just training and fitness, it's dieting, it's the sort of self-discipline. It's not doing so many things that, you know, all of us sort of take for granted of doing.
Sure.
What he and other athletes like him, of course, would have to endure. He himself sort of, I think he feels he's probably, I hate to use the word shot his bolt, but I mean, you sort of feel he's kind of, you know, after 3 successive Olympic Games. But he's such a truly phenomenal athlete, and he's so far ahead of the rest of the world in these sprinting events. I'd hate to say he's not going to do it. It would be impossible, but I think it's extraordinarily unlikely. As much as I'd love to see him, because he's such a fabulous character and personality.
You know, theoretically speaking, let's say he said, yeah, I'm going to retire. But he takes 2 years off, and we're getting 2 years closer to Tokyo, and he says, okay, I'm going to give it another shot. How long would it take him to get his body back up to peak performance?
He could probably take a year or so off. I mean, Michael Phelps did.
Sure.
I mean, we thought Michael Phelps was long gone. And, you know, lo and behold, about a year and a half after officially retiring, he decided, no, I'm going to come back and do the Rio Games.
Yeah.
And he did it. And we all saw he did it. He didn't just do it. He did it spectacularly. So he could do it within 2.5, 3 years. It's certainly a possibility. But as happened with so many athletes like him, you know, suddenly the rest of the world starts to catch up.
Right.
I mean, it seemed for a period of time that, you know, Serena and Venus Williams, you know, were simply untouchable on the tennis court. But then suddenly the rest of the world catches them up. Roger Federer for a couple of years was untouchable.
Sure.
And suddenly others catch him up.
Sure.
So, and, you know, there's a lot of young bucks underneath waiting, chasing Usain Bolt. So,
what were some of the things that you expected to happen for these games, and then what are some of the things that you didn't expect to see and that happened?
Well, one of the things that clearly, 2 things really people felt could really compromise these games. Well, 3 things, I suppose, looking back at it. One was the pollution in the waterways of Brazil. There was a real fear that this would cause serious damage to the health of competitors and could potentially compromise the actual sports themselves. That was not the case. And there was very, very little interference with the sports. There was a lot of fear that the debris and the muck in some of these waterways would really hamper sports. But they didn't, not in the ways that affected medals or performances in any serious way. So the pollution, there was a lot of fear that this caused some real health problems and could cause performance with athletic events, and that didn't happen. The other thing everyone was really worried about, I mean, we were all worried about, was the Zika virus.
Sure.
But the CDC, Center for Disease Control, and the World Health Organization have since announced that there are no reported cases of Zika as a result of the Rio Olympic Games.
Wow.
So, I mean, that was another success in a sense for the Olympic Games, but that was a fear. The biggest fear of all, though, and my biggest fear, was not the political and economic circumstances, tough as that was for Rio, because the Games were actually well sheltered in that regard, but the fear of terrorist attack. Now, whether that was a local terrorist attack or a international incident, that was clearly something I think we were all worried about. We were anticipating it, and it didn't happen. The one thing that did happen I didn't expect to happen was Ryan Lochte. I mean, who knew? I mean, how can you predict sort of that sort of behavior in ways that in a sense compromise these games? I mean, Ryan Lochte will go down in history. I mean, as much as he may try to rehabilitate himself and his image, the truth of the matter is these games will always be remembered for Ryan Lochte. His name is written indelibly in black ink in Olympic history.
How did you feel as the Olympic Committee, the Brazilian Olympic Committee, handled that incident?
Well, of course, everyone tried to keep it quiet in the sense that the International Olympic Committee met with the United States Olympic Committee, all of whom met with the Brazil organizers, and it was sort of determined to keep this on the quiet, and they would deal with Ryan Lochte in their own way. And then Ryan Lochte himself walked across the street, got in front of the television cameras, and kind of ratted on himself in ways that shocked, actually. It seems to have really shocked the United States Olympic Committee. They weren't expecting that. They thought they were going to handle this with due diligence in a quiet, effective way that did not compromise the Brazilians in the Olympics. But Ryan Lochte, it seems, had other ways of dealing with it. So, I mean, I think, frankly, it seems to me that the Brazilian organizing committee was extremely tolerant and diplomatic in the way they dealt with this. I give them full credit for this. And I said they did try and cooperate with the Olympic authorities, American and international, to try and not make it a national event, to not compromise the media presentation of the game. But it was not to be.
Yeah, I was impressed when they chalked it up to, well, he's a kid and kids make mistakes, and that ability to try and move on from it, but he buried himself. What impact did these games have on Rio, on Brazil, both positive and negative?
Yeah, and there's a lot of positive and there's a lot of negative as well. Is that Rio and Brazil successfully pulled off the double. They not only pulled off the Olympic Games, of course, but they pulled off the World Cup soccer.
Yeah.
And they did both effectively, in the sense that neither one was seriously compromised by any serious incident that truly compromised their performance. In terms of another positive, the Olympic Games forced the hand of Rio and the Rio officials to clean up the waterways and the beaches and the sort of geographical area. They weren't as successful as they would have liked to have been, but they did nonetheless clean it up by about, well, the figures everyone throws around is anywhere between 70 and 80%. So it was an effective way, in effect, of leveraging the Olympic and Brazilian authorities to actually clean up Rio and to make an effort really seriously to clean up these waterways. They promised to actually clean them up completely.
Okay.
But they didn't. And Guanabara Bay was about 75% clear. And the pathogens off of Ipanema Beach and Copacabana, Flamengo Beach, both close to shore and offshore, was still at the high enough levels that American beaches might have been closed, but it met the water safety standards set by the Olympics in consultation with all the appropriate authorities. So in effect, Brazil and Rio were effective partly effective in dealing with the waterways. The constructions of the facilities went as well as could be expected. A lot of times facilities are not finished on time. That happened in Montreal in 1976. It happened in Sochi. But these games, the construction of the sites went really well. And I don't know, and I've not heard of any incidents where the sites themselves created any serious problems. The real question for the future is whether these facilities, as with all of these Olympic sites, whether these facilities are truly going to get used effectively in ways that make it truly cost effective. But you now have these spectacular facilities, spectacular golf courses, spectacular arenas and centers that can really enhance the health and welfare of Rio and sustain Rio as a center of athletic World Championships performances. So that was certainly a success. Security. From the perspective of Rio, the security was extraordinarily effective. I don't know if you know this, but they had to employ some close to 80,000 security officials, security agents, to secure these Olympic Games. 65 official troops and security forces and 15,000 volunteer. But I mean, 80,000 people were actually looking over the security video, and they were very effective in doing so. And again, if you think of Brazil, it has something like 60,000 kilometers of open, coastline and border lines that are impossible to fully police. And yet they did an effective job. So in that sense, it had a very positive impact on security infrastructure in Rio and in Brazil. Another positive impact is that there's a beautiful walkway now down on the front. This magnificent promenade with museums, Olympic Museum, that is truly beautiful, and it became a sort of hangout for people at night. People would go down and stroll on it. And then you had the infrastructural improvements to the railroads, to the transportation systems, and to all sorts of accommodations, all of which are successful. So in many ways, a lot of the infrastructure of Rio was truly enhanced with these Olympic Games, and that truly is a positive impact on Rio. There are some negatives, of course. The Olympic Games have exacerbated the economic and political turmoil in Brazil. Economically, these games are going to cost Rio, Brazil, probably somewhere around, hard to always know this. They were guesstimating initially 8 to 10 billion, but I suspect it's going to be close to 10 to 15 billion dollars.
Wow.
Add on to that the debt they incurred as well as the World Cup, and you've got a significant financial burden placed on Rio. The same happened in Athens. I'm not saying the debt incurred by the Athens Games caused the sort of collapse of the Greek economy, but it certainly contributed to it. And I think that is true with these Olympics. They of themselves have not caused the turmoil in the Brazilian economy, but they will seriously contribute to it. And it's going to take a while for Brazil to sort of address all the issues they have to address with unemployment, inflation rate, the sovereign debt rate, the gross national product. They have the falling oil prices compromise them as much as anything. But there's no question that the cost of these games is going to hit Brazil hard. And in many ways, it contributed to the political turmoil that Brazil was facing. Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party president who replaced the beloved Lula, who was the one who got the games to Brazil in the first place, has suffered, of course. It has been impeached. And Michael Temer has taken her place, so a more right-wing government has now come into place in Brazil with sort of well-publicized consequences. There are no women on his cabinet, no African Brazilians or minority Brazilians on the cabinet, which has caused some concern. But again, these Olympic Games and the corruption associated with it in both direct and indirect ways compromised Dilma Rousseff such that it contributed to her impeachment and the successful impeachment of her. The Olympics are tied up in the famous Petrobras corruption scandal to do with the nationalized oil company in Brazil. It's a long, contorted story, but Dilma Rousseff was president of Petrobras, and while she herself has not been indicted for personally illegally using funds, she has been involved in the Petrobras incident. In America, you could say we have a military-industrial complex. In Brazil, you have a construction-industrial complex. So the construction industries are extraordinarily powerful in Brazil. They carry enormous political and economic clout. And in cohorts with this Petrobras oil company, and certain politicians created this snarl, which involved all sorts of corruptions and paybacks, which involved the actual construction of Olympic sites. So it's all intermingled in there. So that's been a problem. The other thing that the Olympics, it has caused some serious environmental and human rights issues, and that's something that the IOC has to be truly mindful of, especially when we think the games are coming to Beijing again in a not too far distance future. But in order to bring off these Olympic Games, they had to level a lot of the favelas. Particularly the Via Autodromo, which is the one that was almost completely eradicated to build the Olympic facilities. The displacement of the homeless, reports of racialized violence in terms of relocating people when they needed to make places available for construction. A lot of concerns, a lot of they guesstimate that about close to 100,000 people were dislocated by the Olympic Games. Now, many were relocated, many were paid handsomely, many were not. And one of the downside is the destruction of these favelas, which, are the slums of Rio, but in them have these very powerful, long-lived communities and cultures that have been sort of wiped out in some cases. So it's hard not to put that on the negative side.
How does the IOC protect places like Rio from themselves?
They don't really. The IOC has to assume that the proposal that a city sends in its bidding process is accurate and appropriate. But once the IOC awards the Olympic Games to a city, it is largely the organizing committee that takes on the responsibilities, ethical, financial, political, construction to pull off the games. Now that doesn't mean there aren't IOC members, and typically it's not actually IOC members, but it's sort of the technical and consulting experts they use, often from previous games, often various political, administrative, sport bodies, particularly the international federations of sport, to make sure that, you know, as well as they can, that the organizing committee is doing what it's saying it's going to do. It's going to do it in time, and it's going to do it in ways that, you know, are not destructive, particularly for the Olympic movement in terms of their reputation, their status, their branding. But most of it is reliant on the actual organizing committee themselves. I mean, the International Olympic Committee is an interesting organization if you think about it. They own these Olympic Games, but they actually don't. There's no material organized. There's no material infrastructure to it. It's just they own the right to award the games to someone. They just hand it off to somebody else.
And they assume a huge profit, obviously, from these games and leave some of these cities with some debt. And
that's one of the problems. And it works both with the IOC and with the host cities. As far as the IOC is concerned, they're the ones that negotiate the fees for these Olympic Games. In a sense, they negotiate all the media fees, all the television fees, all the branding fees. You know.
Which is where the big money's coming from.
It's huge money. Yeah. I mean, they're at the top. It's called the top, TOP, the Olympic program. And this is where these truly international sponsors work with the IOC to gain sponsorship rights. And it costs 7-8 figures to be able to use the Olympic rings as part of your marketing. In fact, the Olympic rings are, I believe it's fair to say, I think I'm right in saying, they are the single most expensive brand identity in the world. If you want to put your Olympic rings on something to sell your widget, it's going to cost you 7 or 8 figures at least. If you want to really do it. So the IOC, you know, pulls in all this money from the coffers, then hands off the liability to the organizing committee. It's a great gimmick if you can get it. Great gimmick. And then the IOC, the organizing committee is the one that organizes it. And one of the problems associated with this, and this is where the Bostonians who reneged on the 2022 games came to understand, was that so often what has happened is whenever these Olympic Games incur a debt, the debt is hoisted off on the public, so the public has to pay it. It is typically not the private enterprise and private entrepreneurs who do so much of the construction and the building. These are not the ones that incur the cost. It's the public that incurs the cost. And Bostonians came to realize that, as so did the Norwegians in Oslo, and so did the Swiss, and they all said no to recent Olympic Games because they do not want to incur what always ends up, inevitably, far more expensive than these proposals say they're going to be.
Well, one last question, Jeff. Where do you see these games kind of standing in the history of the Olympics?
Well, they will go down, of course, as the first Olympic Games to hold dog Olympics. They will go down as the first games to be held in South America. They will go down as the first site to hold both the World Cup and the Olympic Games at the same time. They will go down as an example, a further warning to all other host cities that the games are always more expensive and more problematic than they might seem. I mean, they're awarded 7 years ahead of time. Rio was awarded the games when their economy was an all-time high. They actually had to pull off the games when their economy was in the tank.
Wow.
And that's a problem with a 7-year wait. A lot can happen economically and politically, and these games probably showed it more than any other games. in the sense that, as I said, they rewarded the games when they were economically robust, and they had to pull them off at a time when they were economically hurting.
Yeah.
And the cost associated with security, the cost associated with construction, it's very difficult. If the economy had flourished and stayed where it was, and the employment rate stayed where it was, it would have gone down as probably one of the most successful games in Olympic history.
Yeah.
So it really has highlighted those sorts of problems, particularly the economic.
Yeah. Oh, terrific. Well, Jeff, I speak for everyone here when we say thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thanks so much for those out there watching, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.